The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the hospital corridor as Nina's heels clicked against the polished floor, each step heavier than the last, her chest tightening with dread she could no longer contain. The dim fluorescent light above flickered faintly, reminding her of fragile hope, of a life clinging to threads, yet refusing to break. A nurse glanced at her with solemn eyes, and Nina whispered to herself, "Please, not him, not today." She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling as if the weight of her entire past pressed against her palm. As the door creaked open, silence swallowed her, a silence so thick it crushed her spirit before she even heard the words. The doctor turned slowly, his expression already carrying the burden of truth, and Nina's heart collapsed into the hollow of her chest. He said, "I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do." Her breath caught, tears forming instantly, spilling before she could fight them back, each drop burning her skin like fire. Nina whispered, "No, you're wrong. He promised me he'd fight." The room blurred, reality spinning as grief tore through her body like shattered glass cutting into flesh. She staggered forward, gripping the edge of the bed, her reflection caught in the polished steel rails, a broken woman staring back at herself. Her world collapsed, and all she could hear was the echo of her own heartbeat breaking, a hollow drum inside a cavern of despair. The night air was damp as Nina stepped outside the hospital, her breath visible against the dim orange glow of the streetlights. She felt the weight of the words still pressing against her chest, a hollow ache that no sound could escape. The world moved around her. Cars passed. People walked, yet everything blurred into silence as if her grief had swallowed sound itself. She whispered, "I should have been there sooner," her voice breaking into the cold wind, as if apologizing to someone who could never hear her again. Her hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket, clutching a crumpled photograph that once gave her strength, but now only deepened her sorrow. She leaned against the hospital wall, staring up at the night sky, searching for a sign, a star, anything that could assure her the pain would not last forever. Instead, the sky stared back, vast and merciless, reminding her of the emptiness she carried. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, but each inhale brought back the doctor's words, and each exhale carried the sound of her heart breaking all over again. Nina walked down the empty street, her heels clicking softly, each step echoing against the lifeless night. The photograph in her hand shook as if vibrating with the energy of the past, and she whispered, "Why does it hurt so much?" Her eyes scanned the shadows, but every corner seemed darker than the last, as if the world was conspiring to bury her in grief. A stray cat darted across the road, startling her, pulling her momentarily from her sorrow. Yet the emptiness returned as quickly as it left, and she quickened her pace, desperate to escape the silence chasing her. The street stretched endlessly, lined with flickering lamps, the hum of electricity in the wires above the only reminder of life. She pulled her coat tighter against the chill, her breath quick and shallow, as if afraid to inhale too deeply, afraid to let herself feel the weight of her loss. She whispered again, "I can't do this alone," her voice trembling as her shadow stretched long behind her under the dim glow of the lamps. As Nina turned the corner, the familiar sight of her apartment building rose before her, but tonight it felt foreign, almost hostile. The windows glowed faintly with warm light, but none of it reached her heart, which sank deeper into shadows. She whispered, "Home doesn't feel like home anymore," her voice trembling as she stepped toward the entrance. The stairwell smelled of dampness and dust, carrying the weight of unspoken memories, and each creak beneath her feet echoed with accusations of guilt. She pushed open her apartment door, the silence greeting her like an old enemy. The air inside was stale, frozen in time, as if the walls themselves refused to move forward. Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph on the table, staring at it with glassy eyes, unable to look away. She collapsed into the chair, her body folding inward, her spirit heavy with grief, and whispered, "What's left of me now?" The room seemed smaller than before, as if her grief had pressed the walls closer, suffocating her with invisible hands. She stared at the photograph, fingers tracing its edges, her lips parting but no sound escaping. She remembered laughter that once filled these walls, the warmth of moments now gone, and the memory stabbed at her heart. Nina whispered, "I failed you," her voice breaking into fragments that barely reached her own ears. She buried her face in her hands, her body trembling as if her soul was unraveling thread by thread. The silence around her deepened, the ticking of the clock louder, crueler, as if reminding her of every second she had lost. She pulled her hands away and stared blankly ahead, her eyes red, her face pale, the photograph lying limp in her lap. She whispered again, "I don't know how to keep going," her words a plea to the empty room, swallowed by shadows that offered no reply. Morning light crept reluctantly through Nina's curtains, spilling weakly onto the walls that seemed gray even in daylight. She sat slumped at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her body was present, but her mind was lost in fragments of memories that cut sharper than knives. She whispered, "Every corner of this place feels haunted," and her voice cracked in the stale silence. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only reminder that life still moved around her, indifferent to her pain. Her hand hovered over the photograph lying on the table, but she pulled it back as though it burned. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into every movement, and her breath trembled, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of yesterday. The walls seemed to close in, and with each tick of the clock her chest tightened more, as if grief itself was suffocating her. She whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore," her voice breaking as she pressed her palms against her face, wishing the world would stop spinning long enough for her to catch her breath. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, jolting Nina from her trance. She hesitated, staring at the door as if it were an intruder to her fragile world. Her body stiffened, and she whispered, "Not today, please," but the bell rang again, insistent. Slowly, she pulled herself up, dragging her feet across the creaking floor, each step reluctant. When the door opened, Sarah stood there, her eyes filled with quiet concern, her presence both comforting and suffocating. Nina forced a weak smile, but her lips trembled, betraying her despair. Sarah said, "I had to check on you," her voice soft yet firm, and Nina lowered her gaze, ashamed of being seen so broken. The silence between them carried more weight than words, an unspoken understanding of pain neither wanted to name. Nina stepped aside, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Come in if you must," her tone laced with both gratitude and reluctance, torn between wanting company and craving solitude. Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps light yet deliberate, as though careful not to break something fragile. She placed a bag on the counter and said, "I brought you food. You need to eat," her tone laced with quiet insistence. Nina sat back down, her gaze fixed on the photograph on the table, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. She whispered, "Food won't fix this," and her words cut the air with the weight of despair. Sarah's hand rested on Nina's shoulder, steady and warm, and she whispered, "I know it won't, but you don't have to carry this alone." Nina's chest heaved, her breaths uneven, and she felt the dam inside her threaten to break. She wanted to scream, to run, to collapse. But instead she sat frozen, her grief spilling only through the silent tears that streaked down her face. Sarah stayed by her unshaken, her presence the only anchor in Nina's unraveling storm. Hours passed, the two women sitting in heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady but soft, "He wouldn't want this for you." Nina turned sharply, her eyes fierce through her tears, and snapped, "Don't tell me what he would want." The outburst startled them both, and silence fell again, heavier than before. Nina's breathing was ragged, her body trembling from the weight of unspoken guilt. She pressed her hands against her forehead and whispered, "I should have done more," her voice cracking with self-blame. Sarah moved closer, whispering, "You did everything you could," but Nina shook her head violently, refusing to believe it. The truth clawed at her, a relentless voice whispering from the shadows of her mind, and she buried her face in her hands, unable to silence it. The room seemed to shrink, suffocating them both with the weight of grief and denial. The sun dipped lower, painting the room in fading gold, though its warmth failed to touch Nina's heart. Sarah rose from the couch and whispered, "You can't keep drowning in this, Nina." Nina lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes red, and whispered, "I don't know how to stop." Sarah's expression softened, her voice steady as she said, "One breath at a time. That's how we start." Nina exhaled sharply, a sound between a sob and a sigh, her chest aching with the effort of simply existing. The clock ticked louder, its rhythm cruelly reminding her that time continued no matter how shattered she was. She whispered, "I can't promise I'll make it," and Sarah knelt beside her, taking her trembling hands into her own. "Then I'll promise for you," Sarah said gently, her tone unwavering. And in that fragile exchange, Nina felt the faintest flicker of something she had thought gone forever: hope. The following morning, Nina wandered through the city streets, her body pulled forward by habit, though her mind resisted every step. The world bustled with life around her, shops opening, children laughing, cars honking, but it all felt distant, muted, like a film playing behind glass. She whispered, "They all keep moving, but I'm stuck in yesterday," her voice trembling as she hugged her coat tighter. Each face she passed seemed to remind her of what she had lost. Every laugh a dagger, every smile an echo of the happiness she could no longer touch. She ducked her head, hiding in the shadow of her grief, yet the weight pressed heavier with each passing moment. She turned into a narrow alley, desperate for silence, her footsteps echoing sharply against the damp walls. Her chest rose and fell quickly, panic seizing her, and she whispered, "I can't breathe," as though the air itself was betraying her. The city no longer felt like home, only a cruel reminder of her brokenness, and each corner threatened to suffocate her with memories she could not escape. In the silence of the alley, Nina felt her chest tighten, as though invisible hands pressed against her ribs. Her vision blurred, the world spinning in fragments of color and shadow, and she leaned against the cold wall, gasping for air. She whispered, "Please stop," her voice raw with desperation, yet the panic surged harder, dragging her deeper. Her mind filled with flashes of the hospital, the doctor's words, the photograph, and her body shuddered under their weight. A single tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another, her breath sharp and uneven. She pressed her forehead against the rough wall, closing her eyes as if darkness could shield her. Her knees buckled slightly, her body threatening to collapse, but she clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain upright. "Not here," she muttered, trembling, ashamed of her weakness. The alley swallowed her cries, and for a moment she felt as though the world had abandoned her entirely, leaving her alone with the echo of her breaking heart. A voice from behind startled her, firm yet steady, "You shouldn't be here like this." Nina turned sharply, her eyes meeting Marcus, the man she had not seen in years but never truly escaped. His presence sliced through her panic, stirring anger and fear all at once. She whispered, "Why now?" her voice quivering, her body stiff as though preparing for battle. Marcus stepped closer, his sharp gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable, and said, "Because you can't keep hiding from what you left behind." The alley seemed to shrink, trapping her between the past she feared and the present she despised. Her breath caught, her hands trembling, yet her anger pushed through her grief. "You don't know what I've lost," she snapped. But Marcus's silence carried more weight than words. He only stood there, a mirror of her regrets, a reminder that some wounds never healed, only festered in shadows until forced into the light. Nina's voice cracked as she said, "You left me with nothing, and now you stand here as if you care." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "I didn't come to care, Nina. I came to remind you of what you owe." Her breath hitched, rage and grief colliding in her chest like a violent storm. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing through the tears, and whispered, "I owe nothing but pain, and you gave me plenty of that." His lips curved into a half smirk, cold and unfeeling. And he muttered, "You'll see soon enough, it's never that simple." The alley seemed colder, the shadows pressing against her as if conspiring with him. Her body trembled, but she refused to look away, meeting his stare with defiance. For the first time since the hospital, her grief transformed into something sharper, more dangerous, a fire lit by fury. She whispered, "I won't let you drag me back," though her voice betrayed a flicker of doubt that she tried to bury. The silence after their exchange was deafening, the kind of silence that carried promises of battles yet to come. Nina's hands shook, but she drew a deep breath, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Her heart pounded in her ears, but she whispered, "You can't control me anymore," as though testing her own strength. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying her with a look that unsettled her more than anger ever could. He whispered, "We'll see," before stepping back into the shadows, his presence fading yet his threat lingering like poison in the air. Nina leaned against the wall, her body weak, her knees nearly giving way, but her spirit clung to the spark of defiance she had found. She pressed her palms against her face, whispering, "I won't break this time," though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. The alley remained empty now, but the echo of his words haunted her, warning her that the fight was only beginning. Nina sat on the edge of her bed, the city lights spilling through her window in fractured patterns, painting her walls with restless shadows. Sleep had evaded her, stolen by the echo of Marcus's words that lingered like smoke. She whispered, "He'll destroy me if I let him," her voice trembling as though confessing to herself. Her fingers gripped the sheets tightly, her knuckles pale, fighting to anchor herself in a world that felt like it was slipping away. She remembered Sarah's gentle voice, the promise of support, but tonight the promise felt far away, drowned out by memories of betrayal. Her heart ached, her mind waged war, every thought louder than the last, pulling her deeper into despair. The air felt heavy, suffocating, yet somewhere beneath the weight of grief, a spark of defiance still glimmered. She exhaled sharply, whispering, "Not this time," as though testing her courage, and for the first time in days she let her anger fuel her will to fight. Morning broke with gray skies, rain streaking against the windows, and Nina forced herself up despite the exhaustion in her bones. She stared at the mirror, her reflection hollow-eyed and pale, and whispered, "You look like a stranger." She washed her face, the cold water biting at her skin, grounding her in fleeting moments of clarity. Each breath felt heavy, yet she forced herself to move, to prepare, to survive. The silence of her apartment screamed, but she grabbed her coat, clutching it close as if it could protect her from more than the chill outside. As she stepped into the rain-soaked street, she whispered, "Today has to be different," though the tremor in her voice betrayed her doubt. Each drop fell like judgment, but her footsteps pressed on, defiance carried in the simple act of refusing to stay inside. The world would not wait for her grief, and she knew she had to face it, even if she was not ready. Nina entered the small church tucked between crumbling buildings, the scent of candles and old wood flooding her senses. Her chest tightened as memories of her childhood prayers surfaced, back when she believed hope lived in these walls. Father Daniel approached quietly, his calm presence easing the weight in the air. "You carry too much alone," he said gently, his voice firm but kind. Nina lowered her gaze, shame flickering across her face, and whispered, "I don't know how to let go." He placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, reminding her of strength she no longer recognized. "Grief doesn't vanish," he said, "but it transforms when shared." Tears welled in her eyes and she whispered, "I'm afraid of being consumed by it." His expression softened, his tone unwavering. "Then let it consume me too, so you don't have to bear it alone." The silence between them held weight, but also a fragile promise of healing. Hours later, Nina sat in the back pew, staring at the flickering light of a single candle. Her thoughts spiraled, the flame mirroring the fragile thread of her will. She whispered, "If he takes this from me, there'll be nothing left," her voice cracking as if speaking to the flame itself. Her fingers tightened around the wooden pew, her nails pressing deep into the grooves. Father Daniel's earlier words echoed in her mind, offering comfort she wasn't ready to accept, yet she clung to them all the same. Memories of Marcus's cold smirk intruded, pressing against her like shadows refusing to fade. Her breath quickened, her shoulders shaking, until finally a sob escaped, raw and unrestrained. She whispered, "I'm so tired," as her tears fell freely, the candlelight blurring through her grief. For the first time, she allowed herself to break openly, and though the pain still consumed her, it no longer felt like she was suffocating alone. As dusk settled, Nina stepped back into the rain-soaked streets, her mind still haunted, yet strangely lighter. The church doors closed behind her, leaving her with nothing but the sound of raindrops against concrete. She whispered, "I can't keep running," her tone quieter but steadier. She pulled her coat tighter, the fabric heavy with water, her body shivering against the cold. The city lights shimmered through the mist, painting the streets with muted colors, their beauty softened by sorrow. She walked slowly, her reflection fractured in the puddles beneath her feet. Every step a battle between collapse and survival. Her chest still ached, her grief still raw, yet a flicker of strength sparked with each breath. She whispered, one step at a time, repeating it like a fragile prayer. And though the night swallowed her figure, her resolve burned quietly, fragile but unbroken. A promise to herself that the past would not drown her forever. Nina returned to her apartment, the walls feeling heavier than before, yet no longer suffocating. She dropped her soaked coat onto the chair, her body trembling from the cold, and whispered, "This place won't break me." She moved through the dim space slowly, each step deliberate, as though reclaiming ground stolen by grief. She lit a candle on the table, its glow soft and steady, filling the room with fragile warmth. The photograph lay waiting, its edges curled, its memory painful, yet she touched it gently without pulling away. Tears welled in her eyes, but her hand remained steady, no longer recoiling from the pain. She whispered, "I loved you and I'll carry that, but I can't drown in it anymore." The words hung heavy, but they did not crush her. Instead, they echoed like the first notes of healing. She sat quietly in the flickering glow, her breath steadying, and for the first time in weeks, silence felt less like punishment and more like peace. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and golden, chasing away the shadows that had ruled her nights. Nina sat by the window, her hair brushed neatly for the first time in days, a quiet strength shaping her posture. She whispered, "It feels different today," her tone tentative yet hopeful. Outside, children played, their laughter carrying like distant bells, and instead of breaking her, it stirred a longing for life. She sipped from a fresh cup of coffee, its warmth soothing, and let herself breathe without the weight of guilt pressing every inhale. She thought of Sarah, of Father Daniel, of the words that had anchored her when she wanted to fall apart. Her heart still hurt, but the pain no longer owned her completely. She whispered, "I'll try again." Her words soft but resolute, and though small, it was a vow that carried the weight of survival. Later that day, Sarah visited, her footsteps light as she entered the apartment. Nina met her at the door, her face pale but calmer, her eyes carrying both exhaustion and quiet resolve. Sarah smiled softly and said, "You look stronger today." Nina returned the faintest smile, whispering, "I'm trying." The two women sat together, the silence now different, no longer suffocating but companionable. Nina's hand trembled slightly as she poured tea, but Sarah took it without hesitation, her touch steady and reassuring. They spoke little, words unnecessary in the fragile comfort of presence. Nina whispered, "I don't think I could have faced this without you," her tone thick with emotion. Sarah squeezed her hand, replying softly, "You were never meant to." Their shared silence filled the room, no longer heavy with grief, but with the faint beginnings of healing, an unspoken promise of better days ahead. Evening settled with soft twilight hues painting the sky, and Nina stepped onto her small balcony, the air crisp and cool. She looked out at the city, the skyline glowing faintly against the fading light, and whispered, "I'm still here." Her fingers rested lightly on the railing, her grip no longer desperate but steady. She remembered Marcus's threat, his smirk, his voice, yet tonight it carried less power. "You won't win," she said firmly, her tone sharper, a vow carried into the night air. The city's hum surrounded her, cars below, voices rising and fading, but for once it felt like she was part of the world again, not a shadow hiding from it. Her breath steadied as she closed her eyes, her face tilted toward the sky. For the first time, she did not feel crushed by silence or memories. Instead, she felt a quiet strength, fragile but real, and it stirred like dawn inside her chest. Night returned, but this time it felt different, no longer an enemy but a quiet companion. Nina lay on her bed, the window open, letting in the cool breeze that carried the hum of the city. She whispered, "I survived another day," her tone quiet but resolute, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The photograph still rested on her table, its memory painful but no longer unbearable. She touched it gently, whispering, "I'll carry you, but I won't drown anymore." Tears filled her eyes, but they no longer felt like defeat, only release. She closed her eyes, the weight in her chest still present but lighter, no longer suffocating. Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she whispered, "Tomorrow, I'll try again." The silence of the room wrapped around her, but instead of emptiness, it carried peace. For the first time in her long, harrowing journey, Nina allowed herself to rest without fear. The evening air was heavy with tension as Nina walked the deserted park path, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the silence of night. She had been summoned here by a message she both dreaded and needed to face. Her breath fogged in the cool air, heart pounding as she whispered, "It ends tonight." The shadows stretched long beneath the lamplights, the trees looming like silent witnesses to her turmoil. Marcus stood ahead waiting, his presence a dark silhouette against the pale glow. His voice carried, cold and sharp, "You came after all." Her body stiffened, every muscle coiled with fear and defiance, yet she stepped forward. "I won't let you control me anymore," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The weight of her grief, her fear, and her guilt pressed on her shoulders, but beneath it all was the fragile strength she had been building. Tonight, she would not run. Tonight, she would confront the shadows that had haunted her for too long. Nina stopped a few feet from Marcus, her breath uneven, the silence between them thick with unfinished battles. He smirked faintly, his voice steady, "You still think you can walk away?" Her hands trembled, but she held his gaze, whispering, "I already have." His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening with frustration, and for a moment his calm cracked. He stepped closer, his presence suffocating, pressing into her space like a shadow swallowing light. "You owe me everything," he hissed, his tone sharp with venom. Nina's chest heaved, her body trembling, but she whispered back, "I owe you nothing but the silence you deserve." Her words carried more strength than she felt, but the defiance in her tone made his smirk fade. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, and she clung to that flicker of power. Her fear was real, but so was the fire rising from beneath it, and it burned brighter than his control. The night pulsed with energy as the confrontation deepened, Nina's breaths sharp and unsteady, Marcus's voice low but cutting. "You're nothing without me," he said, each word heavy with disdain. She flinched, old wounds tearing open, yet she refused to look away. Her voice cracked but firm. "I'm more without you than I ever was with you." The words struck harder than she expected, his expression faltering, rage flickering in his eyes. He stepped closer, their faces inches apart, the tension electric. Nina's chest rose and fell rapidly, fear clawing at her, yet defiance held her steady. "You can't undo me," she whispered, her tone quiet but resolute. Marcus's jaw clenched, his fists tightening, the silence thick as though the world held its breath. For a moment, she thought he might strike, but instead, he stepped back, his eyes cold, his smirk returning faintly. "We'll see," he muttered, but the uncertainty in his tone betrayed his weakness. The confrontation broke into silence, Marcus turning slightly as though retreating, his shadow stretching across the path. Nina's heart hammered, her body shaking with the adrenaline of standing against him. "I'm done letting you haunt me," she whispered, the words tasting like freedom. Marcus paused, his shoulders rigid, but he did not turn back. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the rustling of wind through the trees. Nina's knees weakened, yet she stood tall, her chest rising with sharper, steadier breaths. For the first time, her grief and guilt did not bind her, they fueled her courage. She whispered again, "I survived you," the words firmer, stronger. Marcus finally walked away, his figure dissolving into the shadows, leaving her trembling but unbroken. Tears filled her eyes, Not from despair but release, her body shaking with the enormity of what had just passed. Tonight, the power had shifted, and though fragile, it was hers to keep. When Marcus finally disappeared into the night, Nina collapsed to her knees, her body trembling but her spirit alight with newfound strength. The cold air filled her lungs, sharp but invigorating, and she whispered, "I did it." Her tears spilled freely, streaking her face, but they carried release rather than defeat. She pressed her hands to the damp pavement, grounding herself in the reality that she had survived. The voices of the past, the shadows of guilt, no longer screamed. They faded into whispers she could ignore. She whispered again, steadier now, "You can't own me anymore." The words echoed into the stillness, carried on the wind like a vow to herself. She lifted her face toward the lamplight, its glow harsh yet warming, illuminating the traces of resolve in her expression. For the first time since her world shattered, Nina allowed herself to believe she was free. And in that fragile freedom, a new chapter quietly began. Morning light poured into Nina's apartment, warm and golden. She sat at the table, a faint smile touching her lips as she whispered, "I miss you, but I'm still here." Her hand rested on the photograph, steady this time, not trembling. For the first time, silence felt like peace, not punishment. Sarah visited her, knock gentle. Nina opened the door with calmer eyes, whispering, "Come in." They sat together, tea steaming between them. Sarah smiled softly, "You've changed," and Nina replied, "I had to." For the first time, their silence felt safe, filled with quiet strength instead of grief. As dusk fell, Nina walked the park path with Sarah, the same place that once held fear. She whispered, "It feels lighter now." Sarah replied, "Because you're stronger." The lamplights glowed warmly, no longer shadows of dread, but guides into the future Nina was ready to face. Inside the candlelit church, Father Daniel approached softly. "You've walked a long road," he said. Nina whispered, "I still hurt, but I can carry it." His faint smile answered, "That's strength." The candlelight flickered across her face, no longer broken but alive with fragile peace. That night, Nina stood on her balcony, moonlight silver against the city skyline. She whispered, "I survived," tears glistening but her smile steady. The wind brushed her face as she whispered again, "Tomorrow begins again." For the first time, she truly believed it.